subject to government control and scrutiny. So it's not quite a public sector enterprise, but it's being called the National Infrastructure Fund, but in fact, it is nothing but a trust. It's a vehicle that hopefully will do the following. So by creating a trust structure that sits outside the normal general ledger of government, it allows the creation of a financing vehicle that is off budget. I know the IMF doesn't like that. Yeah, but it has the nice feature of circumventing, maybe not the politically correct word, but but basically getting around, not being subject to the fiscal constraint imposed by the fiscal responsibility legislation, right? Now, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? I think that obviously, if these funds are misallocated, it's a terrible idea. But if they are properly invested, then it's a very good idea, because these investments are critical to actually supporting a step function improvement in the growth trajectory. So if they are properly and strategically deployed, then this works. And if they are misallocated, it's a double failure. So the institutional form and governance of this fund becomes absolutely critical. The idea is that this platform ought to be a catalyst to help existing institutions not act as a replacement for them. So for example, can funds from this receptacle, this vehicle, be deployed to strengthen the balance sheets and therefore the capacity of 2 or 3, not very many, existing institutions that are in the position to provide long-term funding for infrastructure? So whether it is the IIFCL is one example, the National Housing Bank could be another example, certain quarantine ring-fence projects of the railways could be a third example. But these are the types of things that it could do. The idea is not that it becomes another BNDES a la Brazil, but acts as a catalyst and a support for existing institutions that are not half bad. So that's one thing it does. Second thing it is supposed to do, and there's still a lot of confusion in government about this, it's critically important that a proper distinction be understood between debt financing and equity financing, right? Whereas it's much easier to crowd in debt financing from private parties and deploy it into projects, it's much harder to crowd in equity financing from private parties and deploy it in projects that are meant to serve the public interest. I fear that there is a confusion in government's mind, because there are some people who are arguing, well, can't this fund become another Temasek and use, and become really like a private equity fund manager that will raise money from international private equity, LP type, funding, and deploy it into public infrastructure? My answer to that is absolute no. You don't want to do that. But third-party debt financing, definitely it can mobilize from the private sector. Final point I want to make is really to give you the example of the Indian Railways. And the Indian Railways is a classic case of a poor public investment vehicle. So what has happened is that the Indian Railways, from its inception, was actually created to be a corporation, managed professionally outside of government, right? That's why it has its own budget and so on. But in fact, it is run as a ministry. And so its investment priorities over the years have been completely corrupted, perhaps is too strong a word, but I'll use the word corrupted, by the political priorities of the political masters that oversee it. The parliament sees it as its right to determine how the Indian Railways actually invest its resources. But the Ministry of Finance insists that the Indian Railways should act and behave as a corporation. And they keep admonishing the railways and saying, why aren't you able to generate surpluses? And why do I have to keep underwriting your investment program? So the institutional form for the railways has become a big debate. Does it need to be corporatized? And I suspect that for a variety of reasons, it's probably too late for it to be corporatized. But then what can be done now for us to get out of this morass in the railways? So there again, what is being mooted is a version of what is being mooted at the general budget level for the NIF. So in the current constraints and institutional constraints of the railways, which is it's a ministry, let's accept that, is it not possible to create an off-budget vehicle, right? The allocation of whose proceeds are overseen by a set of independent trustees, right? And the funds to this vehicle are allocated against a very clearly thought out and ring-fence investment plan of projects. And then there are dedicated people within the railways that are aligned to actually implementing that investment program, right? So you're trying to create institutional ring fencing within a wider structure that otherwise falls into the usual problems. It's vulnerable to the usual problems of just general government financing and structure. So that is the type of thinking that is being debated. I don't know how far it'll get. Improving institutional form for public investment is not a trivial problem. And these are just a couple of suggestions in the context of that debate.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Thank you. I think you get a sense of the fairly large and widespread institutional issues that still plague the whole infrastructure area in India. And that's a real challenge as we go forward. And we look forward to learning what the solution is from Mrs. Sindhushri Kuller, who, as you know, is the CEO of the Niti Aayog, which is a relatively new institution. In a way, it's a successor institution to the Indian Planning Commission. She used to be the Secretary of the Planning Commission until a few months ago. So she can not only tell us the solutions to the infrastructure problems for India, but also perhaps in a minute or two, if she wishes, tell us a little bit about what she sees as the the kind of institutional mandate for Niti Aayog, especially as we've got quite a few participants from overseas who are not that knowledgeable about this transition which has taken place a few months ago in India. With that, I invite you to speak either from there or there as you like.
I think I'll follow Rajiv's leadership in this, that all the domestics are better off sitting. Thank you very much, Shankar. One of as the cliche is that speaking last always leaves you with very little to say. But fortunately for me, I had already expressed my inherent shortcomings about not knowing too much beyond the domestic sectors and the domestic experience, and in particular of drilling down the efforts of government in particular in infrastructure. So I think I will actually take off from where Rajiv left off, and some of what I propose to place before you are really issues which go beyond the financing aspect of infrastructure. First, the 11th plan saw a huge jump in private sector participation, which was unusual in the previous 10 plans. The infrastructure investment went up from 22% to 37% from the private sector. And so based on that, the 12th plan, which began in 2012, presumed that almost 48% of the 55 point something lakh crores would come from the private sector. But of course, the huge downturn in the global economy, various events around the world, as well as domestic problems which plagued individual sectors, overcame these expectations. As a result, when we are analyzing what has gone on so far, it's mostly a very non-optimistic scenario that has come to pass. Usually, in the plan, when there is a midterm appraisal, which is in the 3rd or 4th year of the plans, usually the 3rd year, this year we are going to do it in the 4th, there is a shortfall of about 10 to 15% in plan expenditure. This is basically expenditure by government or governments, both state and the central government. In the 12th plan, this shortfall is as much as 20 to 25%, which is borne out by the sub 5% growth that we saw in 12-13 and 13-14. So given that the PPP version 1, I'd like to call that, had many of the problems which Rajiv has already outlined, and secondly, that the private sector was not forthcoming in many of the sectors which were open in infrastructure for private financing or PPPs. Budget 15-16 has seen a huge jump in budgets provided for the infrastructure sectors. Now, a number of these sectors are what in Government of India are called the central sectors, which is the union list, mainly roads, ports, inland waterways, aviation, and to some extent, irrigation. Irrigation, I think, comes last because it's also taken up by the state governments. So there's almost 100,000 crores extra in the 15-16 budget, mostly allocated to roads, power, and to some extent, railways. Now, all three will need, given the budget cycles, will need to show progress with that enhanced budgets in the current year, which ends in March. Now, that is where I will also like to thank the presentation made, because it so neatly put the problems in 3 boxes of planning, allocative, and implementation functions. All 3 functions in the infrastructure sectors are predominantly performed by Government of India or its entities or its institutions. And all 3 have not performed very well so far. The PPP mostly was in roads. And in the beginning of the year, the economic survey put one of the major impediments to growth as stalled projects. We did an analysis of the 100 top stalled projects by value and found that 65 of them were in the infrastructure sector. Of the 65, 41 were in the private sector. Of the ones which were across both private and public sectors, the major problem sectors were roads and power. To a lesser extent, railways. Again, the diagnosis was very simple. All 3 of them were stalled for reasons with differential emphasis: land acquisition, environmental clearances, and to other regulatory clearances, including many projects which were stuck in disputes and continue to do so. So I would say that a lot of time and effort until now has gone into unblocking those blocked projects. And a lot of energy across various arms and legs of government have gone into making these stalled projects move. Has it happened? It's too early. 6 months for an infrastructure project is too short a time, but at least the diagnostics seem to be in place. At least in the government sector, which now has to run, because if they don't spend the money allocated, their budget lapses. Unless, of course, it goes into the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, which Rajiv mentioned. So what do we find today? We find a great deal of emphasis, and again, a lot of energy and time in making sure that the money moves, the finances move down to the project, and the projects actually, quote unquote, absorb the amounts allocated to them. In the government system, there are many systemic blocks which seem very small or trivial. Biggest among them is the budget cycle itself. The actual working time for any project in India is a maximum of 6 to 7 months. The first 3 months, for some reason, between April and June, is spent in ensuring that, for example, in the railways, that the Northeast Frontier Railway actually gets the amounts which it needs to get for its N number of 9 or 10 huge national projects. Likewise, for the remaining 9 months, 3 months are the monsoons, so there's not much action on the ground. So that leaves most projects with 6 months. And again, there comes the issue of implementation abilities or implementation blocks. Many institutions, such as the railways, the only disagreement I have with Rajiv so far, whatever other problems that the railways may have, their implementation and execution capacities are time-tested and excellent. Given the financing, given the clear timelines of a project, they deliver. In the road sector, somehow that has not happened so far, partly because of the large number of products that the NHAI and others are saddled with. They have contracts which are called item rate contracts. They have contracts called BOT annuity. They have now something called hybrid annuity. So as a result, managing each one of those contracts requires a different kind of ability and a different kind of expertise, which, in my view, most of our execution agencies do not have. And this, I'm talking about the central government. I continue to hold a very unpopular view in government that finances are not a problem in government, for government finances. The problems are the ability to move that amount to where it needs to go and to make sure that the projects move. From the policy to the project, identification to monitoring, tracking critical paths, and then from tracking to monitoring projects. That is where the biggest weakness currently in government, within government lies. We have very expert people or groups at all levels, but most agencies work through subcontractors and smaller agencies down the line. And the harder the area to get to, the more difficult it is to make those contracts work. Why am I saying why am I bringing up these micro issues here? Because I believe in the end, the last box which was pointed out in the IMF presentation is what is stopping the infrastructure sector currently from unlocking or unblocking its full potential. Financing and unblocking all those constraints, which I think have been dealt with at length before, will enable us to move faster in future. Making sure that PPP version 2 does better than PPP version 1. Second, it also moves to sectors other than roads and to some extent ports, will certainly make sure that the future is better than for now. But let me also point out that by the time that happens, we should not have another 250 or 500 projects which are presently running cost and time overruns in the government sector. We've been monitoring that also very closely, and the more we get into it, the more disappointing the details look. There are projects which, in the railways for instance, which have been going on for the last 20 years.